Good evening and welcome to the City Council meeting of the City of Lenoir for Tuesday, March 5th, 2019. We welcome you here this evening on this historic night as we have seen Mr. Orr move from one side to the other side.
Take that personal.
Me too.
I know.
And we welcome our new city attorney to his first official meeting to that. Welcome, Mr. Orr, and glad to have you back sitting with us again up here.
It's good to join you again.
Yes, thank you. All right, we will get started as we always do with a moment of silence, and we will remain standing for our Pledge of Allegiance. So if you'll please join the council. And please bow. Thank you. Please salute the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Our first item tonight on our agenda is an update. These are zoning changes, and I will welcome our planning director, is Jenny Wheelock, who will present an update on the proposed changes to the City of Lenoir zoning ordinance. Jenny, welcome.
I didn't realize I was this soon on the agenda, so. All right. Well, I've been talking about this in Committee of the Whole for several months now, and you will be getting in your packets for next month about a 86-page ordinance. It's a very technical ordinance, so I wanted to take a time to kind of do a high-level overview, kind of walk you through sort of a little bit of what my daily life is like dealing with our existing ordinance and some of the goofy things in there and what we're proposing to change and kind of the why, rather than walk you through, line by line, these are what the changes are.
I think we'll receive that at our next meeting of the 19th.
19th, yes.
19th, okay.
Sorry.
You said next month, but it's still
Oh, guys, March already. Yes, okay. The 19th, correct. So before we start, just a really quick zoning 101. Zoning got started pretty much at the beginning of last century. And the goal was to separate incompatible land uses. The famous case out of Euclid, where one property owner sued another property owner about putting, like uses next to each other, or unlike uses next to each other. That's where we get the Euclidean zoning. The Supreme Court upheld it as constitutional, and then everybody started adopting these ordinances that regulated land uses. The other things that these ordinances started to regulate was setbacks. This was the era of tenement housing. We saw minimum housing standards arise, and also we had buildings that were built right on top of each other where they would block somebody's sunlight or airflow. And so the basic premise of zoning is sort of, here's the zones for these uses, and you have to build buildings this far back off your property lines. It's kind of the most basic start of it. And we also saw subdivision standards arise, and this is really one of those things that was happening during the post-war development period where, their funding was available, people were buying houses and settling down and raising families, and we saw the proliferation of this across the country, single-family, large lot subdivisions, the infrastructure maintenance taken on by the governments when they were built, and this is a lot of what our code was really designed to regulate and build. So our zoning ordinance was adopted in 1978 in its current form, hasn't changed a lot since then. And our zoning ordinance, like all zoning ordinances, were really crafted with this great sort of modernist school of thought where we were going to plot out and do better than all of the centuries before us. And it's really aimed towards greenfield development in all ways. So new greenfield commercial development, what should the standards be? New greenfield homogeneous residential development, what should the standards be? And what we've found over the years is this created lots of developments that in many ways worked better than the previous development, but they were created all at once. They kind of rose out of the ground complete, and they haven't really been able to change with the changing needs of people. And so we're starting to find they decline all at once. Things have to be repaired all at once at the same time when you sort of have that homogeneous development. So, and the other thing is really for Lenore, our greenfield development has mostly been developed. We are very constrained as far as where we're going to grow in the future. Our growth is going to be infill and redevelopment. So when I sat down to look at this ordinance, there's 4 overarching goals that I'm trying to sort of stay true to as we get into the nitty-gritty of like 25-foot setback versus 35-foot setback. The number 1 goal is transparent, accessible regulations that anybody knows this is what the standards that apply to my property are. We want to facilitate productive reuse and infill whenever we can. Putting buildings back into productive use that are sitting vacant is a good thing for our aesthetics and also for our tax base, and also infill sort of gradually intensifying over time helps us leverage our existing infrastructure investments. We want to increase the variety of allowable housing types. We hear over and over and over again that we don't have enough options for folks housing. And then to really move towards more context-sensitive zoning. So I've been working on this ordinance for about 4 years. As goofy little things have come up, I've incorporated them in. I mean, really, this represents some major goals of mine. My staff really likes this. It's going to help a lot of things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. The planning board was presented all of these changes in November. Oh, I put the wrong dates in all of this. 2018. They're not that much futurists. So November of 2018, we presented it to the planning board. Man, my planning board will be real pleased with me. I'm giving them a lot of credit here. November, I presented it. I gave them this big notebook that had all the changes sort of spelled out in it. December 2018, we did some informational sessions on infill development and a movement called the Strong Towns Movement, which I'm not going to spend a ton of time on today, but I may send you some follow-up materials. I think that really guides, it has a lot to do with trying to make sure our regulations aren't hindering the flexibility the private sector needs to be responsive. In January, I held one-on-one workshops with every planning board member. They came into my office, they sat down with me and my staff. We talked through what their specific questions and issues were, just on a one-on-one basis. And then during the January meeting, I highlighted all of the changes of sort of like, this is what the standard was before, and here's what we're moving to, any place that there might have been a change. And we discussed those and came basically to the proposal that's before you, or will be before you. And then in February, so last month, I workshopped with them some densities of various neighborhoods and apartment complexes, because some of it does involve some opening up of some by right multifamily housing types. So I want to make sure they're real comfortable with the density. And they recommended to call for the public, or they called for the public hearing and recommended approval to this body. So that's where we're at. We've scheduled the public hearing for March 19th. So goal 1, this is really where it all began. The rules are very, very complicated to try to interpret, understand, easy to miss certain things. And so we wanted to make it just easy for everybody to understand. I get phone calls like, what's my setback? And I say, I'm not sure. So this is the entire scheme of zoning ordinance. I won't go through this, but the square around there, Articles 5, establishes all the zoning districts, so it lists them all and says this is a district, this is the intent statement, here's what we want in these districts. The next one establishes a permitted use chart. That's all that's in that section. Article 7 has stuff about buffer yards and various things that apply regardless of the zoning district. And then Article 8 has the zoning district regulations. So if you're R9, there's a section that says R9, and you look up and there's all the rules in theory that apply to R9. So this permitted use chart is the thing that really started it all. This 249 separately delineated uses. It spans 13 pages of the code. And I tell you, I never find the use that the person is proposing on it in 249 uses. So I make a lot of determinations of best fit, closest fit, and this all over the country. This is how zoning ordinances work. It's really hard to see up there. But one of the things I've highlighted is music studios, music stores, and musical instrument stores are 3 different uses, and they're allowed in different zoning districts, which is insane. So how do you figure out what somebody's proposal is, and do we care to regulate to that level? I highlight on the other side, main branch banks are different than, or the main office is different from a branch office for a bank. And they're allowed in different places. I don't know, that just seems crazy to me. So it's fun stuff. So what I propose is we create categories of uses with similar characteristics and impacts. We can define differences between uses. What I am arguing is that those differences don't matter between many uses for our purpose. So if you're retail, you're retail. And I don't really care if you're selling flowers or plates or guns, you're really still retail. And now there will be some compression there. We do use some footnotes to clarify where there's a specific, maybe there's a separation standard, or maybe there's another standard that might apply that would change for a certain district. And then I moved all of the other performance standards that have to do with uses into this section. So you'll see a lot of strike through and underline. They're not new rules. They just make sense to be in this section. So things about mobile homes, for example, and all of those, we would move it into this section. So this is the new table, what gets created, 2 tables from 13 pages and 249 uses. Now we have 2 tables, residential uses, non-residential uses. That's the residential use table as proposed. What I've highlighted on here is one of the nice things that this allowed me to do is call out some missing middle housing types, and I'll get into that in a minute, but forever, multifamily has been 3 units or more, and that has been a single use. Meanwhile, we distinguish between branch office and main office of a bank, so it's a little. Now it will be low-density garden apartments, and then the rest of the higher density, some mid-rise, high-rise apartments as 2 separate use categories, and it lets us carve out some allowances where maybe there weren't before. And then there's 1 table of non-residential uses. As you can see, really, we've collapsed down a lot of categories into things that make sense. Yeah, I've highlighted the retailing. We have light retail, we have intensive retail, and neighborhood business. 3 categories compared to, dozens of different retailing uses that were delineated before.
I'm sorry about that.
And eating and drinking basically get all kind of collapsed together. If you're a coffee shop or a cafe or a tea room or a restaurant or a sit-down restaurant, which are 2 different uses right now, you're eating and drinking. Drive-through is the difference there because drive-through uses absolutely have different impacts, and so they may be appropriate in different places. And then related to that is these zoning district regulations. So we've got right now currently a chart of permitted uses that spans for 13 pages. And then we have a whole other section that basically repeats the whole chart, just not in chart form. So every time you get to a zoning district, it relists every use that's allowed, every use that's conditionally allowed. And then when we change it over the years, they start to conflict. And so now different parts of the code don't match up with each other. If they reference the other section of code in each zoning district, it says, and check this section for your buffer yards, and check this for your parking standards, and check this for your loading standards. Well, it's implied all of the things apply. You don't have to put that all in there. And then we have these crazy setback scenarios, and I'll just walk you through one. So this is my messy desk and my code. This is the B2 district. There's all the uses again that are allowed in B2. You can see my notes up in the top right-hand corner. Cultural and community facilities are listed here as a conditional use, but on the chart they're permitted. Flea markets is the same thing, so there's some really just oddities in this. And then my favorite part of the code, gosh, I can't read it from here, but So basically, if somebody calls me and says, what's my setback, my front yard setback in the B2 zoning district, how far you have to be off the road? Well, if you're doing residential development and your right-of-way is a certain width, then it's a certain number from the center line. But if it's lower than that, then it's a different number from your property line. If you're doing non-residential development and you're doing rear or side yard parking, you have two different setbacks based on the width of the road. Or if you have front yard parking, there's yet another setback. There's about 12 different options there, which really doesn't make a lot of sense. So what I've done throughout here to sort of try to help this is I took the least standard. So the shallowest setback under any of these scenarios is a 10-foot setback off the property line. Tomorrow, or should you adopt this ordinance, when somebody calls and says, what's my front yard setback? I'm gonna tell them 10 feet. Because if someone is allowed to build 10 feet, then that's the characteristic of your street. Somebody could always set back further if they wanted to. And so that's sort of, it shouldn't really matter if you're residential or non-residential at that point in time. So all of that, which you'll see most of the strike-throughs in the ordinance, basically delete all of the district regulations that are repetitive and collapse them all into a single chart with some footnotes, since there are some odd scenarios. But basically now you can see the relationship between districts, because at a single glance you can see the minimum lot size in R15 is 15,000, and it goes down to 12,000 in R12 and 9,000 in R9, and you start to understand, if my zoning doesn't work for me, here's what I need to rezone to. And I think it's a much more transparent way to talk about zoning. The last line I've highlighted there at the bottom, I added this, we've never had this before, is a maximum residential density expressed as dwelling units per acre for each zoning district. This is related to both creating some by right multifamily and also to give the planning board and the council some guidance when you have conditional use permit requests come before you. You're tasked with making hard choices about how much is too much, what type of development would be overly detrimental to the neighborhood. You're meeting those standards. Well, there's no performance standards programmed into the code currently. So somebody has a proposal and it's almost like, the burden of proof is really on this body and the testimony provided to say, no, that's way too much. It's very hard. So moving forward, there would be a maximum cap that would help address that situation and try to push more intense projects to the more intense zoning districts. So the goals 2 and 3 are really related: productive reuse and infill, and then increase the variety of allowable housing types, because really increasing the variety leads to productive reuse and infill. And this is more of sort of the overarching philosophy when I go to collapse all of these regulations that are very, very specific for each district and each use into more broad and general categories. There's always going to be those weird instances where something doesn't quite line up. And so whenever I was making choices, this is what's guiding me. This is an example that has circulated around in my field, but also I know that a lot of, city managers and other things we're talking about development and the tax base. This is an example from Brainerd, Minnesota. And there's an old and blighted block the city has identified as being ripe for redevelopment. And there hasn't been really new investment for years in this block. And then you have a similar sized block that was, bought up, assembled, raised, and redeveloped in accordance with all of the modern zoning rules into it's like a taco store or something, for fast food. And the new shiny and new redevelopment is actually valued lower than the old and blighted block. And they've started doing this analysis in towns all over. And what they're finding is really the density of the use still has the value, and to allow for sort of the reuse and adaption over time rather than pushing for this full raise and modernize, actually a better deal for your taxpayers as well. So this does not fix this problem in the code. There's nothing amazing in this ordinance that's going to contribute to really building our tax base. But whenever there was a choice to be made, I always sided on the side that would make it easier to apply to existing buildings and easier to administrate in that way instead of demanding, demolitions and rebuilds like this. So things like, oh, you can't put that use in that building because you don't have parking or something. Well, that would, ensure that that building stays vacant. Whereas if you have that flexibility, to me, it makes more sense, even doing zoning administration, to have it, each building can get improved based on the market and the needs of the owner as time passes. The context for all of this, we've got all these shopping malls that were built under modern zoning ordinances, and we have that same thing in our community, this idea of Grayfield, where you have developed sites. They're big boxes with lots of parking. They don't meet the needs of those retailers anymore. How do you, still have value there? How do these get reused, and does our code work to apply to them? This is not a particularly attractive example of a house-to-business conversion, but there's real value here because building a business from scratch, like the bottom right corner, may be just financially unattainable for some people, but they may be able to pull off the addition. So we've got structures that have value still if we can allow for them to be used. So again, this doesn't fix any of these or propose anything groundbreaking, but this is the philosophy behind the decisions in the ordinance. And of course, the missing middle. We've got the single family on the far end, we've got the mid-rise apartments on the other end, and then we've got duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhomes, live-work units. All of those things become more defined in the code. More options are opened up for them in the appropriate zoning districts that have always had those intent statements to provide for a mixed density of housing, your R6s and your R9s. We're not talking about your R20 single-family areas. So that's an accessory apartment and a quadplex on the bottom, and it's a way to sort of intensify over time. The impacts of these they're the same as the single-family home. It doesn't add a bunch of traffic. It's not like building 100 apartment units next to a neighborhood. This is how we continue to leverage our existing infrastructure, our existing land, to fit more people into our town and grow our tax base in a way that doesn't grow us out where we don't have room to go. The last goal of this ordinance, and I'll take questions, is this idea of setting up context-sensitive zoning. The other thing, when you delete this much of the code and collapse this much together all into a few charts, it was impossible to do without looking to make sure that the zoning districts still worked in the way that we want them to work and apply. Out of all that, we eliminated the B4 district, or proposing to eliminate the B4 district entirely. And another one of the public hearings that was called for March 19th is rezoning the handful. It's like 30-something properties in the entire city have that zoning today. It's just a sort of outdated, it hasn't worked, nobody's developed under it. We're adding a new zoning district, residential commercial. This is where those higher density residential projects would be allowed. We're not assigning it on the map anywhere, but it provides you a legislative option to entitle property rather than having to go through a quasi-judicial hearing. So it gives folks a way to ask for more, and you can talk with the neighborhood and have meetings and really get to where you want to be without having to do that complicated conditional zoning, which I know we've expressed, frustrations with in the past. And then I modified some of the intent statements for B7 highway business. Right now, only 2 properties in the whole city have it. When we were compressing into the charts, we're trying to look to the future. And pretty much this is the example here. Right now, all that red or orange or whatever color you'd call that, that's Smith Crossroads at the bottom. This is the core of a development corridor, B2.
Orange or the red?
The orangey color, the ones that actually touch the fattest road on
Like
there.
orange kind.
Yeah, like, let's see if you can see that map, like this color here. So like, that's ABC Court and Smith Crossroads right here, Chick-fil-A. So this ordinance doesn't really get at design standards, but I'm thinking towards the future. This is the district that requires the 8-foot wide sidewalks, the 60% glazing on the front. You know, it maxes out how much stucco you can put on. They're good design standards, and the buildings that have been built and renovated under them, I get compliments all the time, and I'm sure you all do. The problem comes in with this idea of being context sensitive. Those exact same standards apply like here in the heart of Whitnall, where I've got like Fred's and this gas station out here. When they start talking to me about making improvements and I say, well, you have to put 25% brick or stone on your facade and 60% glass, and you're going to have to pay into the sidewalk fund or dedicate an 8-foot sidewalk, they laugh at me and walk away. And if you see where the developments happened, for certain, it can't pencil here. That's not to say that we should get rid of them entirely, but I think that there's a way to adopt more context sensitive where you have less stringent standards in certain areas that aren't going to be as pedestrian oriented or maybe aren't as valuable, where you protect those neighborhoods. So I'm trying to set up the scaffolding that we can look at future rezonings to try to address some of those comments that I'm sure you also hear from developers. The same thing would be down here on South 321, Hickory Boulevard. This is a existing parcel here just north of the new interchange. But they came in and they have a landscape business and they wanted to build like a metal building. And I had to say no. Actually worked with them, and we came to a good compromise place, I think. But it's hard for people who own property like this when we've adopted these design standards, thinking, heart of town 321, but then they're also applied in these areas where they don't work. So that in a nutshell is sort of the major scaffolding changes of the zoning ordinance. It's a lot of little... the devil's in the details with this thing. So I'm available for questions.
Common sense zoning is what it is.
I'm all about common sense zoning. A lot of this stuff is either what people think the code already says or the way I've been administrating it for the past 6 years.
It's a lot of work.
It is, and it's one of those things where there's probably tons of little quirky things in it that we could discuss forever. So what do you need from me? What would you like me to bring back to you? Do you have any questions? Anything
one
particularly
question.
concerning?
Go ahead.
But before, I'd like to commend you guys or your staff on a great report. Glad I don't have to answer all these questions. However, with the streets, I was just concerned about the comment you made about the setbacks. In order to get a good, accurate setback or measurements, would the streets not need to be the same measurements, like in some of our neighborhoods?
Yeah.
The streets where they don't have curbing or sidewalks as opposed to streets that do, those streets cannot have good, accurate setback measurements or the same size width, do they?
So I think that's the reason why the code currently prescribes setbacks from center line and from property line. But we don't have any street widenings or new streets in the capital improvement plan. We know that we can, struggle to pave and maintain the streets we have. We have street standards when new subdivisions are created, but those lots would be created with wide enough streets. And we know that DOT is already pretty much has the right-of-way for the projects on the books for the next 25 years along some of their corridors. So I'm proposing to get rid of all center line setbacks, and the setback would be prescribed only based on where your property line is. There may be a rare instance where a building gets built and then a road needs to be widened and that road was narrower. But I'm really trying to rack my brain and think of a road that would matter on in the city of Lenoir. You're absolutely right. about that. You don't want it too far up on the road if you're then going to do some improvements. But I'm just not sure that scenario really exists. And so what happens with these wide setback requirements is it impacts the developability of land. You reserve land as, not usable for roads that will never come. I don't know if that answers your question.
It makes a lot of sense to modernize our code because there's so much complexity there. How does this compare to municipalities close to us, such as Morganton or Hickory, or are these other municipalities modernizing their code in the same fashion?
I could not tell you definitively because zoning codes are one of those things that end up being very, very unique to the locality because the zoning districts everyone adopts are a little bit different. I know that Morganton did a major overhaul of their code and went towards something called a unified development ordinance. A lot of people like them. It's not a project I really want to bite off for Lenore, but those basically take all of the rules from the streets chapters and the subdivision chapters and the business regulation chapters and the zoning chapters, and they put them together to make sure that they don't conflict. In a way, I'm doing the mini version of that to make sure our articles in the zoning ordinance don't conflict with each other. So Morganton has done an overhaul very recently. From the codes that I have looked at, this is the direction they're going, is to stop enumerating so many uses.
Well, it seems like potential investors would like the simplicity, and there seems to be a lot more flexibility here. And that's what we really need, because we need the housing and we need businesses to be able to build a lot easier. So after I completely dig into it, I'll have more, but that seems like a really good proposal so far, so thank you.
Welcome.
Any other questions? I don't think the idea was ever to make our zoning to where our builders and business people couldn't use it, couldn't.
Right.
I
We wanted to
agree.
make it so, and sometimes I know you do it years ago, 1978 or whenever it was written. Then we had to have something before that, I guess, before and then we adopted this. Now it's time, we're where we need to update it, to modernize it. Yeah, that's a good word, modernize it to fit.
Yeah, I don't think the current regulations are bad regulations or overly onerous, but I think they make sense when you sit in a room and sort of think about it and you look at the code and the scheme and it all kind of lines up, and things like office and institutional zoning allows for residential and non-residential uses. I'm sure that when it was adopted, we were thinking about this has this zone. If someone was going to do a residential plat, this is what the standard should be. If somebody's going to do a non-residential plat, this is what the standard should be. And what you end up with is that, if it was billed as non-residential and you want to convert it, now it doesn't meet the setback standards. Like, the buildings tend to stay. And so we want buildings to be flexible, be able to respond to the market. So
I think the mayor hit on it. It's a more common sense approach. I'm a fan of streamlining. You and I have had
Yeah.
conversations on it. I look forward to seeing the
okay,
finished document.
great. Well, thanks for letting me take this time today.
Thank you. We appreciate
Thank you.
the work you're putting into it. And 40 years, I guess we need to come up with something, don't we?
It's like you're working on the handbook. It's like you're working on the rules that are there. And you're like, we really need to change this, but I just don't really want to do it. And then you finally bit the bullet and did it. So I applaud you. I mean, it'll get it right. I think in the long term, the work will pay off. So
No, just full disclosure, you saw how many quirky things are in the
Yeah.
code today.
Oh, yeah.
Will this ordinance get adopted and something come up that we didn't think of?
Absolutely.
Inevitably. So will I be back before you with some surgical amendments? I wish that I would say no, it's perfect, but it's not.
No. There's always
I think it gets us there, so.
yeah, new city attorney will be able to work out all those kinks for you.
Yeah.
I know. Back when he was on council, he said, when can I vote for it? So, never.
Nothing to do with this.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. We appreciate it very much. Okay, we'll move on. We do not have matters scheduled tonight for public hearings of any type, so we'll move to the consent agenda items, which consist of 3 items. That should be A, B, and C on there. So anyway, it was ACD. We're thinking about some kind of food, I guess, you know. Or is that ACP? Anyway.
ACP.
Anyway.
ACDC.
Mayor's getting hungry.
Item, the first is minutes, and this is from the city council meeting of Tuesday, February 19th, 2019. The approval of the minutes of the city council planning retreat of Friday, February 15th, 2019. And item C, it should be, is the financing agreement. This is for the Lenore metering project. And the recommendation is to call for a public hearing to be held on Tuesday, March 19th, to consider financing of the Lenore metering project as authorized by North Carolina General Statutes 160-20. And there is a note, this project requires the approval of the North Carolina Local Government Commission, or the LGC. So I'll open that to any discussion and/or motion from the council for these consent agenda items.
I move that the consent agenda be approved pending the approval of LGC on the item C.
Okay, you heard the motion from Councilmember Purdue to approve the consent agenda items as presented with the approval of the North Carolina Local Government Commission. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Thank you. Carries unanimously. We'll move on. That we do. Well, this is the time on our agenda for requests and petitions of any citizens. Since there looks like everyone here is a part of our staff, except for Virginia, we'll entertain anything you'd like to say tonight. Thank you for being here and covering our meeting. Seeing no one, we'll move on. We do not have any reports of our boards and commissions this evening, so we'll move on to the report and recommendations of the city manager, Mr. Hildebrand.
Mayor, Council, a couple items for your information. The City County Services Committee will meet on Monday, March 11th at 11:45 at the Community College. The Caldwell County EDC will meet on Tuesday, March 12th at 8 a.m., and that'll be held at the Civic Center. Also, I've noted the ABC Board is going to meet on March 14th, Thursday, March 14th at 2 p.m. at ABC Store Number 1. Also, the Lenore Business Advisory Board will meet on Thursday. That's March 21st, not 14th. 6 p.m., third floor City Hall. The Lenore Tourism Development Authority will meet at 4 p.m. on March 21st, third floor City Hall. The annual Leprechaun Leap 5K, 10K race will be held Saturday, March 16th, beginning at 9 a.m. That's going to be beginning at the Lenore Soccer Complex. And then lastly, the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board will meet on Monday, March 18th, at 6 p.m., and that'll be held at the Mulberry Recreation Center. And that's all I have.
Think leprechauns are going to race in this?
Maybe.
I'm not,
Maybe. The leprechaun leap, that's good. Okay, any questions of Mr. Hildebrand concerning any of those? You did catch the changes. Business Advisory Board will meet on the March 21st instead of the 14th. That's because they will be at the Main Street Conference in Salisbury.
And LTDA.
And the LTDA will be the 21st also at City Hall. That'll be at 4 o'clock. The other one is 6. Okay, if nothing else, you have nothing else? We'll move on. Recommendation report of our city attorney, Mr. Rohr.
Nothing, thank you.
Write that in the minutes. His first report was nothing.
The city's being run perfectly fine.
I do not have anything to bring before you tonight. We will be, though, we will bring this up. The several of the council members and our city attorney are traveling to Washington for the National League of Cities Congressional City Conference. That's the 10th through the 13th, I think. I got that right. And then, of course, our Main Street Conference will be there from March 12th through the 14th. And that will be in the city of Salisbury this year. So we have a large contingent heading down for that. Very excited. We will be quite involved with several things going on there. So hope that if you can, please make plans to be at that conference on the 13th when the awards dinner is going on, and on the Champions Breakfast on the 14th. Several things that concern our city, and we're very proud of that, and we'll talk more about that at a later time. Anything to come before from the council members? Any reports or recommendations? We do have a new chamber director, Mr.
Oh, yeah.
Mr. Willis.
Brian Moore is our new president CEO for the Caldwell Chamber of Commerce. I've invited him to come in a meeting to introduce himself to you guys and to the council in the near future. So you'll hopefully be hearing a lot. This is his first week, so if you guys see him out and about in the community, he's a good one. So we're really excited about that.
Okay. Anything else to come before the council? If not, we stand.
Yeah, we'll
Go
be
ahead.
talking about, Motown Review, the Freedman Culture Center will be putting on their third annual senior talent show. And we'll be recruiting some of our council members. We're putting that together, but more to come on that. We will have another council meeting that we can talk that up. But if you need tickets, we have tickets. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be held at the old William Lenore Gym at the Freedman Culture Center. We had about 120 people there, and this year is Motown Review. So stay tuned for more.
Okay.
We're recruiting acts.
Ike and the Vandellas.
Sounds good.
Hey.
All right, nothing else to come before us. We stand adjourned.